morning, everyone, both those of you here in the room and to all of you watching the live stream. And welcome to PRIO and this event titled 30 Years After the Genocide in Rwanda, Gender, Accountability and Atrocity Prevention. My name is Torunn Tryggestad and I'm the Deputy Director here at PRIO, and I'm also heading the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace and Security. And this is a center that serves as a resource hub here at PRIO for research, teaching and training on the gendered dimension of peace and conflict. And organizing events like these is something that we do regularly to communicate our research and to engage the public in discussions about pressing issues. Before we start, some practical information. As I already indicated, this event is live streamed and it will be recorded and made available online on the web pages of or the YouTube channels of all the organizing institutions. If you could be so kind to make sure that your mobile phones are turned off and maybe even turn off the Bluetooth function, because it has a tendency to, disturb the sound system here in this room. And then in case of emergency, God forbid, there are exits in the two corridors behind you and also this door to the right-hand side. And let me see, was there anything else that I should inform you about? Yes, toilets. The very end of the corridor behind you where you entered this room. Okay, it now is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Jan Heiret, the director of the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies, which is the main organizing center of today's event. And they generously invited the PRIO Center and the Center for Gender Research at the University in Oslo to co-host this event. So we thank you for that. Please, Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies was established as part of the restitution process addressing the elimination of the Jewish community and Jewish property in Norway during the Second World War. Through the establishment of this unique center, the mandate was to research and teach about the past, and also to play a role in the present and in the future. Through our cooperation with Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have been able to strengthen our work on contemporary issues, such as genocide and atrocity prevention. I wish to thank the State Secretary Kravik and other partners in the ministry for this cooperation over several years. One result of this cooperation is today's event, which looks back to commemorate the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 30 years ago. The event also looks to the present and to the future, with the aim of contributing to stronger atrocity prevention through a gender perspective. As the director of the Norwegian Center of Holocaust, it's my pleasure to welcome the distinguished guests we have invited to this event. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Honoré Gatera, Director of the Kigali Genocide Memorial, Rwanda. Erik Møse, former President of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and current Chair of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Jacques True, Director of the Center of Excellence for Elimination of Violence Against Women, Monash University. And Savita Pandey, Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm looking forward to your contributions and to a fruitful debate. I also wish to thank PRIO and the Center for Gender Research at University of Oslo for also cooperating in this event. First of all, it is my pleasure to invite State Secretary Andreas Kravik to give his opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to appear before you and to give some opening remarks related to this very timely event commemorating the genocide in Rwanda. It has been 30 years since the horrible genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda took place. Since then, the abduction and murder of thousands of Yazidis in Iraq by ISIS has also taken place. And it's a stark reminder of everything that we still have to do in order to prevent atrocities from taking place. Today, the horrifying pictures from the war in Gaza also underscores that we need to do more to prevent atrocities. The lessons from Rwanda are more relevant than ever before. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda firmly established that sexual and gender-based violence can form part of a genocide. The Rwandan genocide also exposed that the international community had failed to preventing that genocide despite clear warnings. And I think that's still something that we need to keep in mind, that even if information is disseminated, it's still up to the international community to take action. And if the international community fails to take such action, the consequences can be devastating, as we saw in Rwanda. The failure to prevent the genocide stained the international consciousness, but it also led to the development of policy tools to prevent future atrocities. Providing regular, accurate, and public reports on human rights situations, as well as on emerging concerns and risks, is critical. And documenting the facts and circumstances of alleged human rights violations and abuses must be ensured. The Human Rights Council has an important role to play in that regard. Today, these legacies relating to gender, accountability, and atrocity prevention will be discussed by a group of panel experts. Sadly, conflicts across the globe illustrate the urgency of these topics. That leads me to my first point. We need to do more to prevent atrocities. Very often, unfortunately, we have discussions about how to ensure accountability, how to ensure that action is taken in order to interfere with ongoing atrocities. But of course, the most effective remedy is to prevent atrocities from taking place in the first place. And despite certain shortcomings, some important steps have been made in atrocity prevention. Key milestones include the establishment of a UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect in 2004. The establishment of the NGO Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, represented by Director Pavondi in the panel today. Looking forward to seeing you here. It's good to see you. It's been many years since we last chatted, but it's good to have you back in Oslo. Excellent. And the publication of the UN Framework for Analysis for Atrocity Crimes in 2014. Early warning monitoring systems exist, which can help direct political attention to countries at risk. Moving from policy commitments to practice is still a huge challenge for atrocity prevention. It is, unsurprisingly, often a question about political will, which can be challenging to establish in a world of increasing great power rivalry. And again, that's something that we're seeing in the context of Gaza, where we have countries, large countries, inhibiting the international community from acting the way we think the international community should be acting. Namely, there should be a ceasefire, there should be more civilian, there should be more protection of civilians, and there should be much better humanitarian aid and goods and services provided to those suffering in Gaza. But unfortunately, due to great power rivalry, due to certain states, or I think in this context, a state, this has not gone forward. And that's not just tragic, but it's unconscionable. So we have to do better, and Norway, we are determined to do what we can in order to try to remedy that situation. But unfortunately, it's difficult when you have to abide by international law. You have to abide by the mechanisms that we have. Again, the Security Council has not been able to act efficiently, and therefore this tragedy is still unfolding. So it just goes to show that the great power rivalry, the fact that states are not able to come together and take necessary steps, are inhibiting states like Norway and other states who really want to provide, again, better protection of civilians, ensure that there is accountability, for those who have perpetrated international crimes and to ensure that humanitarian aid is delivered, that it's very, very difficult to have that go forward. So that's something that we have to be adamant about and continue to work towards. Women experiences as victims were clearly established as an important topic by the Rwanda Tribunal. Shifting focus to prevention, a gender perspective should also be integrated into early warning indicators and local protection efforts. A gender lens should also be kept in mind when we are facing the often unique threat posed to members of the LGBTQI community. Women, as well as sexual minorities, may experience repression and abuse that can serve as warning signals. Their efforts to organize and counter abuses may make them effective local allies in atrocity prevention. Accountability is vital to ensure justice for the victims and to deter and prevent future violations. Those committing atrocities must be held accountable, either in national jurisdictions or at the international level. As a permanent court of last resort, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, is a central institution for international accountability and the pursuit of justice, which are key components of sustainable peace, security, and reconciliation. Norway is a steadfast supporter of the ICC, and we seek to promote a strong, effective, and independent court. And what is, I think, especially important in the context of the ICC is that states put their political affiliations aside when the ICC takes action. And we saw this a few days ago when the ICC, or at least the prosecutor, requested the ICC to issue arrest warrants on the 3 top leaders of Hamas, but also on leaders, Israeli leaders. And we saw various states and also non-state stakeholders associated with both sides of this ongoing conflict in Gaza protest against the ICC's, or at least the prosecutor's, decision to move forward, basically politicizing the court. And we tried to be very clear-eyed about what's at stake and that the court needs to be defended. And it's up to the court to determine who should be arrested. It's up to the court to determine how to exercise its judicial discretion. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be very, very adamant about putting political affiliations to the side and really support the court. And that's something that we are really trying to push for, and we're advocating for that internationally. And it'll be very interesting, but also very important now to see how this goes forward, and if the court is able to act with integrity and independence and pursue justice the way itself, the way these judicial institutions want to progress. So that's something that Norway is determined to support, and we will hopefully see that go forward in a way that comports with the court's own judicial mechanisms and with integrity and independence. Let me move to my second point in a second. My second point relates to gender and conflict-related sexual violence is still a major challenge, and that is something that I want to say a few words about. Women and girls are adversely affected by sexual violence in conflict. However, we are becoming increasingly aware that boys and men are also affected, particularly in the context of detention. In 2000, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. This and subsequent resolutions affirm that rape and other forms of sexual violence are used as methods of warfare. In 2008, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1820, which noted that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. Conflict-related sexual violence is prohibited under international humanitarian law. All states are responsible for ensuring that their armed forces comply with obligations under international humanitarian law and offer accountability for violations. The dialogue with weapons bearers is conducted primarily by the ICRC, but also the UN and organizations like the Geneva Call are crucial. Combating conflict-related sexual violence remains a high priority for Norway, as clearly spelled out in our National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security and the revised humanitarian strategy. The Ministries of Justice, Defense and Foreign Affairs all have important goals to deliver in this respect. Humanitarian organizations are doing important work to provide services and meeting the needs of survivors. And I think this is a point that is important to emphasize, that if we want to have effective policies with respect to gender-based violence and ensuring that our soldiers are operating with respect for international humanitarian law, it requires an all-of-government approach. Too often you have ministries of foreign affairs discussing various topics in New York, for instance, or in Geneva, or at various conferences, such as conferences like the one today, without the involvement of the ministries of defense or ministries of justice. And at the end of the day, it's not the ministries of foreign affairs who are in charge of implementing these policies. So we have to be very adamant about bringing on board those ministries, those agencies, those organizations which are in fact responsible for implementing these policies. And that's why when we have devised our strategies and updated our strategies, we have been very, very clear-eyed and very, well, clear towards our colleagues in the MOD and the MO Justice that they have to be involved. It's crucial that they participate, and without them, we're not going to be effective in our strategic thinking, in our practical implementation of these policies that we are so adamant about pursuing. So I think that's a lesson learned for all governments, and something at least that we take very, very seriously. Let me move on to my last point. The recognition of conflict-related sexual violence as a war crime and the importance of meeting the needs of survivors in all their diversity are steps in the right direction. However, progress on accountability is weak. The necessary normative and legal frameworks are in place, but we are lacking in implementation. For many survivors, the process towards legal justice and accountability for the perpetrators is too slow. For many, the social stigma and social exclusion following sexual violence is a cruel reality. Many choose not to report or pursue the case legally in fear of the consequences. For many, the process itself is crushing. Police, security forces, and the justice systems have an important responsibility to protect the rights of the survivors. And I think we all recognize the fact that, of course, it's important to have effective legal systems, not just nationally, but also internationally. And part of that effectiveness is also that every trial needs to be conducted with a degree of expeditiousness. If justice is too slow, then justice is not really delivered. So that's also an important part of what we need to discuss. And I think, and I'm sure Mercer can speak to this, but I think if you look at some of these processes that have occurred related to accountability for international crimes, sometimes they've just been too slow. So we need to strike that balance, the appropriate balance between judicial safeguards, ensuring that everything is conducted with respect to those judicial safeguards, while at the same time moving forward, again, with a sense of expeditiousness. So striking that balance is difficult, but I think it's critical that we are successful. Otherwise, victims are not going to be willing to move forward and provide their testimony, provide evidence, and I think that could inhibit these processes from going forward. Let me end by saying that combating conflict-related sexual violence remains a high priority for Norway, as I've said now repeatedly. It's important for us to say in closing that the challenges that we are facing today underline the importance of learning from our past and finding ways to prevent atrocities. To achieve this, dialogue between policymakers, researchers, as well as people with practical experience, all represented here today, is crucial. So let me end by thanking the organizers, the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies, the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace and Security, as well as the Center for Gender Research at the University of Oslo, for your efforts in organizing this very, very important event. You have summoned a very interesting panel, and I look forward to the presentations as well as the discussions. And I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for your introduction. And well, in today's world, with increasing polarization and growing efforts at undermining previously agreed language and norms on international humanitarian law and bodies like the ICC, I think it's good to know that Norway is continuing its advocacy and support of these instruments, and also you yourself having a legal background. Hopefully the work at the ministry is in the best of hands. Well, now it's a pleasure for me to introduce today's keynote speaker, Pramila Patten. I think this is the 5th time you are here at PRIO or giving a keynote at a PRIO event. And I think this testifies to your sincere interest in engaging with the scholarly community. And I know that this is something that is appreciated also at academic institutions beyond PRIO. So I thank you for that, Pramila Patten. Pramila, she is the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict. And she was appointed back in 2017. And as an SRSG, she is the UN spokesperson and political advocate on conflict-related sexual violence. She chairs the now 24-member UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, and her work is supported by the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. The office that she is heading at the UN was established by Security Council Resolution 1888, adopted in 2009. This resolution is one of a series of Security Council resolutions which recognizes the detrimental impact that sexual violence in conflict has on communities and acknowledge that this crime undermines efforts to ensure peace and security and rebuild societies once conflict has ended. We have invited SRSG Patten here this morning to address the issue of accountability efforts and mechanisms in relation to sexual violence in conflict, especially in light of experiences from the Rwanda genocide, which happened 30 years ago in 1994. So, Pramila Patten, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Torun. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, guests, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be back here, and it is an honor to be amongst all of you. I would really like to start by extending my sincere appreciation to PRIO and the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies for co-hosting this very important seminar on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda, and for inviting me to address you on a very important, but at the same time very difficult theme of gender and atrocity prevention. We are gathered today in a stark reminder of the unspeakable horrors of the world, which the world witnessed in Rwanda in 1994. You will recall that in less than 3 months, 1 million people were deliberately and systematically killed. Lives, dreams, and aspirations were cut short as hate speech fueled violent action targeting the Tutsi population. In that same period, between 100,000 to 250,000 women were estimated to have been raped, and survivors of such violence left with little to no support from the international community. However, the initial silence and inaction from the global community later ignited progress towards accountability, fostering peace and stability, and promoting reconciliation in Rwanda, when in 1998, the ICC the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda determined conclusively that a genocide was indeed committed against the Tutsi. This was the first international court to recognize rape and sexual violence as a component of genocide under international law, signifying that conflict-related sexual violence was an integral part of the process of destruction. Additionally, the court found that acts of rape and sexual violence may amount to crimes against humanity, marking an important milestone in addressing impunity for acts of sexual violence, including as a means of perpetrating genocide and related crimes. When states came together for the 2005 World Summit, at which they unanimously endorsed the responsibility to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, the international community was reeling from atrocities in the Balkans and Rwanda, which had shocked the conscience of humanity. And it was there that the then Secretary General Kofi Annan told the gathering in no uncertain terms, "You will be forced to act if another Rwanda looms." Member states agreed in the World Summit outcome document that such responsibility entailed the prevention of such crimes, including their incitement, that they had a collective responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to help protect populations from atrocity crimes, and that they were prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council should peaceful means be inadequate and where national authorities were manifestly failing to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And a few years later, the world responded to the widespread systematic sexual violence in Darfur and Eastern DRC through the creation of my mandate with the adoption of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1888 in 2009. But today, 30 years on, we meet at a time when violence and atrocities continue unabated in many contexts, and where the utility of the R2P seems to be declining, as crises such as Myanmar, Sudan, and Gaza are assiduously ignored by the countries expected to be intervening. We meet at a time when the R2P's reputation is taking a serious hit, with the doctrine being branded as an a la carte one, with questions being raised as to whether the war in Gaza, Sudan, and Myanmar constitute the final nail in the coffin of R2P. Today we meet at a moment of great global turbulence, where conflicts are raging, tensions are rising, and coups are erupting, with the clock having turned backwards on women's rights in settings like Afghanistan, Sudan, Myanmar, Haiti, and the Middle East, to name but a few. Displacement is at a record high. Global military expenditure is at a record-breaking USD 2.2 trillion, and more than 600 women and girls are currently living in conflict-affected countries. While conflict-related sexual violence is not explicitly mentioned in the R2P doctrine, it is no longer disputed that widespread or systematic sexual violence may constitute atrocity crimes. Security Council in its resolution 1820 underscored that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or constitutive acts with respect to genocide, depending on the facts of the case. And this really ushered in a historic shift in paradigm and perspective, from sidelining sexual violence merely as random acts of a few renegade soldiers, an inevitable byproduct of war or form of collateral damage, to addressing it with greater alacrity as a self-standing threat to collective security and impediment to the restoration of peace. And this sent a clear signal that sexual violence, even in the midst of war, is preventable and not inevitable. It is recognized that sexual violence is used and commissioned as a tactic of war to humiliate, dominate, terrorize, displace members of a targeted community or ethnic group, shredding the social fabric that binds people together with corrosive effects on social cohesion. The creation of my mandate and the appointment in 2009 of the SRSG laid further emphasis on the gender aspect of the responsibility to protect. And since the creation of my mandate, atrocity crimes have been documented through the monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements in the United Nations peace operations for conflict-related sexual violence, and my office has been tasked with the preparation of the annual report of the Secretary General for its consideration by the Security Council. In April, the 15th annual report of the Secretary General was debated before the Security Council, and it brought to light the stark and disturbing reality of CRSV across 21 situations of concern in a context where we documented a dramatic increase of 49% increase in verified cases compared to the previous year. And this spike is particularly alarming in a global context where humanitarian access remains severely restricted and constrained, with survivors not receiving the urgent and critical comprehensive assistance they require. As we speak, Sudan is today the world's largest displacement crisis, with almost 9 million people displaced in just over a year, with women and girls facing increasing risk of sexual violence while fleeing conflict. The RSF military operations across Darfur and more recently in El Fasher has intensified the risk of atrocity crimes, particularly for civilians from non-Arab communities, given the ethnically charged nature of the current violence. And since the conflict began in April 2023, the UN has received credible information on the abduction of women and girls held in captivity, including reports of women and girls raped and kept in slave-like conditions. There are reports that women and girls abducted in Khartoum were taken to other parts of the Sudan, notably the Darfur region, allegedly in chains in the back of trucks. In this climate of extreme uncertainty, it is not an overstatement to ask whether international law is an empty promise, whether our collective responsibility to protect is more honored in the breach than the observance, and whether ensuring and achieving accountability for some of the worst crimes imaginable is within our reach. The atrocity crime of CRSV has indeed been rightly called history's greatest silence and remains one of the most frequently committed yet least condemned crimes of war. Indeed, every new wave of warfare brings with it a rising tide of sexual violence. The ancient trilogy of wartime terror, looting, pillage, and rape, which should long ago have been consigned to the history books, remains in our daily headlines. Over 15 years since R2P was endorsed by the UN General Assembly, and almost 15 years since the inception of the Security Council agenda to combat CRSV, some progress can be assessed, namely in terms of normative evolution, institutional capacity, and operational impact. And there are some striking and instructive parallels between the trajectories of these two agendas. The international community has already set the normative framework by which CRSV should and can be prevented, starting with the adoption of Council Resolution 1820. The Security Council mandate on CRSV was built on the WPS agenda, which affirmed that no conflict or crisis is gender neutral and no effective response can be gender blind. Nearly a quarter of a century since its adoption, efforts to successfully link equality, social stability, and durable peace in the context of atrocity prevention remains hindered. For example, gender equality is today recognized as the number one predictor of peace, more than a nation's level of development, democracy, or religious and ethnic identity. So that this means that we can no longer treat the subjects of world peace and women's rights as separate conversations. Crimes of sexual and gender-based violence, therefore, can no longer be siloed from discussions of mass atrocity crimes. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is not solely the statement of a problem, but also the expression of a transformative solution and an alternative vision to the seemingly endless cycles of conflict, militarized masculinity, inequality, and entitlement. Of course, there are challenges inherent in the foregrounding gender in our analysis of atrocity crimes. The tyranny of the emergency prompts many actors at a time of acute crisis to argue that women can wait and to dismiss gender as a soft issue that is secondary to hard security matters. And that is why it cannot be left in an ad hoc manner to the goodwill of individuals, but must be systematized through training, mainstreaming, resourcing, and accountability. In terms of some striking and instructive parallels between the trajectories of the two agendas, firstly, we note the normative force of the responsibility to protect the doctrine, which has been widely felt in international relations with global standards set and becoming well established, notably of sovereignty reconceived as responsibility, primarily to citizens, but also to the international community at large. The doctrine has been invoked in numerous Security Council resolutions since 2006 and has, to a certain extent, influenced innovations such as the responsibility of permanent members of the Council to refrain from using the veto when confronted with atrocity crimes, though sadly, lately we have all witnessed a different trend. Likewise, successive Security Council resolutions have made it clear that as a crime of concern to the international community as a whole, sexual violence must be addressed in transitional justice processes and excluded from the scope of amnesty provisions. Both agendas remind us that the normative framework is robust. What is needed now is not new standards of behavior, but better adherence to those that exist. Secondly, in terms of institutional arrangements, advancement around atrocity prevention and the responsibility to protect has catalyzed more organized and structured attention to atrocity prevention across the UN system, spearheaded by the Office of the Prevention of Genocide and Responsibility to Protect, and through the global network of R2P focal points. Similarly, the UN is today equipped as never before with the infrastructure to prevent and respond to the historically hidden crime of CRSV under the strategic leadership of my mandate. And this includes the multi-sectoral interagency coordination network that I chair, known as UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, comprising today of 25 UN entities, but also a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict, which aims to strengthen rule of law and institutional safeguards against impunity for these crimes at the national level. Turning to the vexed but critical question of operational impact, I would note that both agendas are first and foremost prevention agendas, which aim to reduce the risk of atrocity crimes before they occur, including by ending the culture of impunity that fuels violations and emboldens their authors. In both agendas, we are at an inflection point. How can we translate commitments into compliance and resolutions into results? How can our collective responsibility yield a real-time collective response? The normative frameworks and institutional arrangements exist for rapid and coordinated action to react swiftly to imminent abuses, incitement, and hate speech before nations and peoples are plunged into crisis. On a positive note, there is no doubt that the UN system is today reaching and supporting thousands of survivors of wartime sexual violence who had once been invisible and inaccessible. Peacekeepers are now systematically trained to detect, deter, and respond to sexual violence as part of their operational readiness standards to protect civilians. The mandate authorizations and renewals of peacekeeping and special political missions include directives on sexual violence prevention and response, though I must say that an increasing surge in mission drawdowns put at risk these operational gains, and we must ensure the reinforcement of women protection advisor capacity in these contexts. Specific designation criteria on sexual violence have been included in 7 UN sanctions regime, which I brief on a regular basis as part of leveraging behavioral change and opening space for a protection dialogue with belligerent parties backed by the credible threat of enforcement measures. Dedicated experts on sexual and gender-based violence are routinely deployed to international monitoring and investigative mechanisms, and there is an ever-growing cadre of specialists in this field. The operational arms of my mandate are delivering concrete projects on the ground to support survivors funded through our dedicated CRSV multi-partner trust fund. We also have on the public historical record 15 annual reports of the Secretary General on CRSV, which not only documents incidents, patterns, and trends of sexual violence employed as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism, and political repression, but also lists or names and shames the parties responsible, including both state and non-state actors. Furthermore, the Secretary General has, since 2009, published annual reports on the responsibility to protect, which have explored various dimensions of the issue, including in 2020, the nexus with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And that report noted the need to deepen understanding of the gender drivers and dynamics of atrocity crimes in order to help states, regional organizations, and other actors more effectively and holistically discharge their responsibility to protect. As part of our operational methodology, which focuses on the anchoring of commitments at the national level, my office has signed a dozen of joint communique and frameworks of cooperation to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence with many of the countries that fall within my remit. And this aligns very closely with the primary obligation of states to prevent atrocity crimes under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and overall international human rights law treaties. As the UN, we can support, but can never supplant the primary responsibility of states to protect their population. In my role as special representative, I have repeatedly called for swift and rigorous investigation to ensure accountability as a central and critical pillar of prevention, deterrence, and non-repetition. The failure to acknowledge and address atrocities is the surest sign that they will continue unabated. Ensuring accountability is essential to prevent genocide and related crimes, laying grounds to address root causes, reinstate the rule of law, and reestablish solid foundations for the future. This is paramount and non-negotiable. Accountability mechanisms and processes provide victims and survivors with the justice they deserve, while honoring their dignity by meaningfully engaging them and ensuring their voices are heard. While not an easy feat, accountability as a means for atrocity prevention is a long-term undertaking that must be complemented by immediate actions to collect and preserve potential evidence and treat urgently the immediate needs of survivors so they can start to heal and recover. As Secretary General Guterres has stated, when we talk about war crimes, we cannot forget that the worst of crimes is war itself. Next month, I plan to visit Chad and Port Sudan to meet with Sudanese refugees and Chadian returnees that have fled Sudan since the start of the hostilities in April 2023. What we are again witnessing in Sudan, including in Darfur and Khartoum region, is unspeakable levels of CRSV being perpetrated, mainly against women and children, and other acts of grave human rights violations with prevailing signs and risk factors for genocide and related crimes. The unacceptable cyclical nature of violence in Sudan makes it abundantly clear that no amount of protection or assistance is a substitute for peace. The aim of my mandate and that of the wider Women, Peace and Security agenda is not simply a war without rape, but a world without war. And the people of Sudan have been crying out for peace now for over a decade. For those that work in this field, there is agreement that prevention is the best protection. And in order to enhance structural and operational prevention of atrocity crimes within the context of the WPS agenda, there are 4 key observations and recommendations to chart the way forward. Firstly, the absence of women from genocide and related crimes prevention effort is deafening. We can no longer treat women as only victims when in many contexts from Syria, Myanmar, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, women are active agents of prevention and accountability efforts. It is our responsibility as the international community to ensure that peace works equally for women and that we take seriously women's engagement as the co-creators of holistic solutions. Secondly, amplifying the voices of survivors and affected communities in prevention efforts is essential. In this respect, we must protect women human rights defenders, many of whom are bringing gender-based atrocity crimes to the attention of the world. Their role in prevention efforts must be supported within the communities and space they operate. The safety of victims and witnesses who bravely come forward to testify must be guaranteed, as well as that of journalists who risk their lives to share these stories with the world. Third, we must be reminded that past instances of genocide, including the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, demonstrated that these crimes do not happen in a vacuum. They are duly planned and coordinated, meaning that there are identifiable early signs, risk factors, and indicators of genocide and related crimes that make it possible to take action to prevent them. The United Nations Framework of Analysis for Atrocity Crimes and my office framework for the prevention of CRSV both provide the basis to detect these risk factors and inform early warning. And finally, accountability efforts need to be bolstered. This includes through the promotion of the universal ratification of the Genocide Convention and other relevant international treaties, followed by their full domestication at the national level, such as the adoption of relevant legislation to criminalize the prohibited conducts and allow for their investigation and prosecution by domestic courts. At the individual level, building an environment that encourages women to come forward and report atrocity crimes is also tied to such accountability efforts. While we have seen in recent years a number of gender justice milestones in Guatemala, in the DRC, Colombia, in third states, pursuant to the principle of universal jurisdiction and in jurisprudence of the ICC, the fact remains, as was pointed out earlier this morning, that the pace of justice is painfully slow, and many women have survived wars only to die waiting for their day in court or for the delivery of reparations. We need to improve the quality of justice, not just the number of prosecutions, to ensure it is timely, accessible, and empowering. In short, we must bring all political, diplomatic, humanitarian, economic, coercive, and non-coercive tools to bear to avert atrocities. In this regard, the aims of my mandate and that of prevention of atrocity crimes are mutually reinforcing. Excellencies, colleagues, the bandwidth of our international community is limited, but even as the eyes of the world are fixated on the horrors in Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine, we cannot avert our gaze from other entrenched conflicts where the needs of survivors and populations at risk remain unmet. From Yemen to the DRC, to Sudan, Haiti, Syria, Mali, Myanmar, the refugee camps of Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, to Ethiopia, nowhere is the level of political resolve and resources equal to the scale of the challenge. At this moment, several states are making deep cuts to their official development assistance, even though sustainable and inclusive development is the surest way to prevent conflict, preserve peace, and promote women's rights. We must recognize that there is no other way to close the protection gap than by first closing the funding gap. And yet, both gaps continue to grow. We know that preventing genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crime against humanity is an ongoing process that requires sustained effort over time to build the education and resilience of societies, ensuring that the rule of law is respected and that all human rights are protected without discrimination, establishing legitimate and accountable national institutions, eliminating corruption, managing diversity constructively, and supporting a strong and diverse civil society and pluralistic media are just some ways that we as an international community can come together to guarantee prevention as protection under the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We need to bring the full repertoire of skills and perspectives to bear in confronting the challenges of our time. We know that local women are often the first to raise the red flag about rising extremism and radicalization, hate speech, the accumulation of small arms and light weapons, and the mobilization and recruitment strategies of armed groups. And yet, they are the last to be heard and heeded by security stakeholders. Security policy is still a male-dominated domain, despite clear and compelling evidence linking gender equality and women's participation with durable peace. Now is the time for unity to replace impunity. Impunity is rampant, affecting individuals, communities, and whole nations, further fueled by toxic masculinity, misogyny, patriarchy, autocracy, and gender apartheid. Even when we prevent atrocity crimes, protection gains will not be sustainable in the absence of equality, empowerment, accountability, and the rule of law. We must confront a better society where no military or political leader is above the law and no woman or girl is beneath the scope of its protection. It means silencing the guns and unmuting the voices of women. Peace is not a passive state. It must be proactively waged because what is at stake for all of us is the quiet miracle of an ordinary life, a life free from violence. I would urge each one of us to reflect on what we will make of this moment. 30 years later, what would we say to Lawrence Nagira, who survived the Tutsi genocide, where 37 of her relatives were killed, who said those who killed innocent people got nothing from their crimes. No one can think about doing it again. Will the injunction of never again continue to ring hollow? Will humanitarian action and civilian protection go down in the history of ideas as a long litany of too little, too late? And will international law and the multilateral system be able to deliver on the commitments to protect civilians from heinous and violent attacks? In these uncertain times, I believe that doubt is justified, but despair is not. Process is not progress. Norms have no power unless they are respected, implemented, and enforced. If we are to truly meet our responsibility to protect, then none of us can rest until every woman and girl, every innocent civilian can sleep under the cover of justice and peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very inspiring and informative also keynote. I would now like the panelists to please take a seat. And Jackie, you're here. And you all have microphones and they're all turned on, I hope. Can you check if the microphones are turned on? Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thank you, Pramila Patten, for giving this keynote and for underlining the interconnectedness of the responsibility to protect and the women, peace and security agendas. And also, thank you to State Secretary Kravik for underlining Norway's commitments to prevention of atrocities and also to prevention of sexual and gender-based violence during conflict. 30 years ago, the genocide against the Tutsi population in Rwanda certainly shocked the consciousness of mankind. Not only the events themselves, but also the inability of the international community to prevent the genocide. Some lessons were learned, at least in theory, and some legacies have remained after the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsi population. One of them, of course, is the development of accountability mechanisms and particularly the establishment of sexual violence as an undisputed crime, war crime and crime of genocide. Another legacy was the need to establish mechanisms or at least norms to prevent atrocities in the future. And these two legacies, accountability and prevention, are the topic of today's panel discussion. My name is Ellen Stensrud. I am head of research at the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies. And it is an honor to lead this conversation today with our four distinguished panelists. We have with us Erik Møse. He is a former judge of the European Court of Human Rights, former president of the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, which of course is of particular interest today, former judge of the Supreme Court of Norway, and also, very importantly, currently Møse is chairing the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by the Human Rights Council in March 2022. We also have with us Jackie True. Jackie is a professor in international relations and director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. She's also a global fellow here at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, so I think it's a nice reunion for you to be here. And her current research is focused on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the political economy of violence against women and sexual-based violence in conflict in Asia-Pacific. We also have Savita Ponde from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, where she is the director. The Global Center was established in 2008 with support of many prominent international human rights leaders and is the world's foremost research and advocacy organization for advancing the international norm of the responsibility to protect, both at the United Nations and beyond. Finally, I wish to welcome Honoré Gatera, who since 2010 has been the director of the Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda on behalf of the Aegis Trust. And in addition to your directorship at the Kigali Genocide Memorial, you have been extensively involved in projects related to the preservation of the memory of the genocide against the Tutsi and participated in training related to genocide prevention, genocide education, and conflict resolution and peace building. This spring, Rwanda has commemorated the genocide that took place 30 years ago. Gatera is himself a genocide survivor. He was 13 years old in 1994 and was able to survive by hiding, first with Hutu neighbors who hid him, and later in the ruins of his own home. Therefore, as the tragic events in Rwanda 30 years ago is the backdrop of this seminar, I would like to start with you, Honoré. Would you please tell us a little bit about how the gender aspect characterized the genocide in Rwanda? Patten has said a little bit about it, but could you tell us a little bit more? And maybe also reflect upon how the accountability process has reflected the gendered violence in Rwanda.
Thank you very much. It's my honor and a pleasure to be here today, this morning, in Oslo. Before I start speaking, with due respect, and as we are in 100 days of commemoration, allow me to stand up. We have a moment for remembering the victims of the genocide against the Tutsi, and I will go on afterwards. Thank you. Thank you very much. Honoring the memory of the victims is key to any activity that we do today, to any education we deliver today, to any background talks we do. And that's the reason why we always place the victims at the center, because we don't want it to happen to anyone else among us and to our children. Talking about the genocide against the Tutsi background in Rwanda, mainly focusing on the gender perspective, is very much important. However, it also requires us to understand the historical background of the genocide against the Tutsi in a country in Africa where in the period of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, a family played the biggest role that you can ever have as a human, because school was not available for everyone. I will talk about this later. If you look at the gender perspective, you will be looking at a family that has a father and a mother, and their role in a family where the mother played the biggest role of educating the children. And as this education was happening at home, it brings us to looking at the generation that was raised from the 60s to the 70s and the 80s, because many of the young people who got involved in the genocide against the Tutsi were gaining education from their mothers and fathers and were the ones to be involved in the killings. It brings us to thinking, what were they learning at their homes? The genocide against the Tutsi, as it was mentioned even in the keynote, it's not something that happened suddenly in 1994. We are commemorating 30 years now. It's a process that took 30 years of preparation. Sometimes we understand 1994 to be the moment of the genocide, but killings that happened in the 60s, 63, 64, when we talk about the Bloody Christmas, where some of the international people who were living in Rwanda by that time described it as a genocide, were actually the roots of what happened in 1994. After the discriminative ideology that we got as a legacy of the colonial masters, Rwanda got a bad leadership that continued to deepen this ideology, and the Tutsi have been a target along those 30 years. And in 1994, that was the ultimate stage where we saw more than 1 million of lives being wiped out in the most atrocious way, where when we talk about gender now, we look at the unimaginable happening in a community of human beings. The gender perspective of the genocide against the Tutsi will be split into, I would say, 3 items. Number one, there is an aspect of always considering that when you talk about gender, many people in the community by that time would think about women. And when we talk about gender, everyone understands women's rights, women promotion, and everyone will be focusing on women. Yes, I agree, because in a community or in an African country in the 90s, where the women's rights were really low. If you talk about Rwanda now, it's one of the countries that has the biggest number of women parliamentarians. But that time, if you look at it, it wouldn't even give you 2%, if I'm not mistaken. So the perspective of talking about women during the genocide is an element that comes straight on your head when you look at the gender part of it. Number one, the victims, because as you have heard, around 250,000 women were raped. If you go into details, it's not just rape. Of course, it's rape to torture them. 2, it's rape to impregnate them, and then they will have children of perpetrators. Number 3, it's to infect them to HIV. And these were the 3 tools of the genocide that women victims were inflicted to. Number 2, you talk about women perpetrators. And this is where it goes even beyond what you could imagine. We know the famous names as Pauline Nyiramasuhuko. You may know the case very much. We know the cases of the journalist at the hate radio RTLM, Bemeriki Valeria. But there are other isolated cases that you would not imagine. I will make reference to a book that was published in 2020, where it was written by Olivier, who I think lives in Sweden. And he was killed by his mother. Even if he's a survivor, he mentioned that it's like, my mother, my killer. In French, it's ma mère m'a tué, or my mother killed me, because he had a Tutsi husband who was killed by the uncles of her sons. And then she decided to also take the sons to the uncles so that they can be killed because they have a mixed blood. Because they are the Tutsi, they have a Tutsi father, so they have a Tutsi blood, even if the mother is a Hutu, and they shouldn't live. It's an isolated case that you may think of, but there are several cases like that. Not only mothers were killing their own children, but also they were even killing their own husbands. So if you talk about the gender aspect of the genocide against the Tutsi, this has to be embedded into it, because we are talking about women so much, and people don't understand how, if you talk about gender and include men, you can see how they even suffered during the genocide. Another aspect is rape was not only applied to women, but also to men, and mainly young boys being raped by women perpetrators. Cases that you will find silenced or that you can't even hear about, but that happened during the genocide. The third category that is very much positive about gender is the rescuers. Because as I mentioned, in such community, in a Rwandan family, women were playing a very big role to retain the family together, to provide much more education to the younger generation. We have a number of women who became rescuers, who were hiding their friends and neighbors into their homes so that they can survive from the killings. I was hidden by a woman, but she was married, and the husband was supportive to that. And that contributed to my survival personally. That's a personal experience. However, there are others who were brave enough to face their husbands who were perpetrators, and they could hide Tutsi in their homes. And this even becomes tricky when we talk about the transitional justice, when you go into the Gacaca cases, how those perpetrators are portraying the act of hiding a Tutsi in their home, and yet they were killers on the other side. It was not being done by them, but by the force and the energy and the courage of their spouses who were protecting those people. So overall, you look at that and say that the gender perspective during the genocide against the Tutsi was in those three angles. And sometimes it becomes unimaginable to think of the horrors that a mother in a community where the mother was the center of everything could commit genocide. But yes, among what we do at the Kigali Genocide Memorial, we learn how the continuum of violence can be developed, how one becomes a killer, and how one can even become a normal person after being a genocide, because it's possible. And we look at that and figure out that we both able to do, we can do both of them. We can either be a perpetrator or not, depending on which path we have taken and which direction of education that we went through. When you look at the militiamen who were being trained, who mostly, yes, were boys, but women played a very big role into being also members of the militiamen. If you look at the role of Valeria Bemeriki at the head radio, because that's another angle as well, because the head radio played the biggest role in the genocide against the Tutsi. As women could educate young people, her speech on the radio, which she in the end recognized, could corrupt so many young people into joining the militiamen and into becoming killers, because she is a mother who is speaking at the radio and can convince more people. It is also important to note that the minority of women who had access to politics, and here I'm talking about the Prime Minister Agathe Uwiringiyimana, were brave enough to face the regime that was planning the genocide, but at the cost of her life, because she was among the first victims who were eliminated by the regime in the night of the 6th in 1994, because she was not supportive, even if she was brave enough to create a political party that was in opposition, or to join a political party that was in opposition, and make sure that they can at least tackle some of the issues that were emerging in 1992-93, which was the final plan of the genocide. And if we look at the perspective of accountability, which always brings me to reflecting that if humanity has accepted that we are unable to prevent mass atrocities, conflict, and genocide, because we go towards accountability because the crimes have already happened. And it's really the biggest failure that humanity has, because we know that this is preventable if we are focusing on prevention and not the tertiary prevention in the aftermath. We know these cases of women being perpetrators of the genocide have been, of course, focused on, and at the ICTR, particularly the case of Pauline Nyiramasuhuko was the one that emerged to even allow the court to determine that rape during these conflicts and genocide is a crime of genocide. And looking at this case, it promoted or it contributed a lot to stopping other cases probably around the world. However, in my opinion, it shouldn't be the case, because we could have prevented it to happen or from happening, so that we are able to make sure that that case doesn't really be portrayed as a case that will go prevent other cases. Hopefully it does, but we are not sure that it does, because conflict, sexual violence, gender-based violence in the conflict zones is still happening. But when we talk about accountability, then I look at the role of women in the Rwandan community today, because gender, as I said, in communities in Africa reflect women and their role, because they can hold together the society in a way or another, one way or another. And we look at how beneficial in a community being sensitive to gender matters can contribute to the welfare and cohesion of the society, because the role of women in the post-genocide Rwanda is unimaginable, because the country has reached a lot, has created the strong roots for a family and a community to be together, giving roles to women who, again, end up by being that center of the family, even if they are involved in other activities of the politics of the country. And if that happened before, I have always thought, when I was invited in this conference, I was always thinking, what if what is happening now was happening in the 60s and the 70s? Would it have changed something to what happened in 1994? And I agree with myself, and it's an opinion that everyone would be debating about, or agree or disagree, but I think it would have changed a lot in a community that experienced genocide, because it has transformed Rwanda into a country that it is today, fostering a balance of gender, limiting any violence that would be made. The first time when I heard about the National Police of Rwanda having an anti-gender-based violence unit, I didn't know about it, but that was in the early 2000s. Already the institutions that were being created were very much sensitive to the topic because of what happened in 1994. So which brings me to concluding that it's something that still needs our efforts. We have a typical example in history, including the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and even other conflicts that are still happening now. But that requires a change in the manner that we manage this, because we seem to be, as a humanity, reacting to what is happening, and yet it has already happened, and we don't have the tools to prevent it from happening if it's going to happen in another country or society. Maybe I can stop from there.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction to Rwanda, and particularly the gender perspective. I would like now to move on to Erik Møse, since you have worked at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Actually, you've been the president of that tribunal, and currently, of course, you're working to document crimes in Ukraine. I think the SRSG Patten, she mentioned accountability quite a few times as an important tool for prevention. But she also posed a challenge. She asked if international law is an empty promise. How did the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda work to establish sexual violence as a crime after the genocide? And how has this affected current investigations, such as the one in Ukraine?
Well, let me first say that both the introductions and the first speaker have been very inspirational, and it's a pleasure to be part of this exchange. And thank you for being here. This question about whether it is an empty process, it's such a strong question, isn't it? And but it's a general question. It's not only linked to the sexual issues. And in order to respond to that question, I would just like to remind us all that, after all, at least the Rwanda Tribunal convicted or had processes against 75 persons. And these were long processes. It took many years. The proceedings took partially time. And some were acquitted and some pleaded guilty. And they were found guilty not only with sexual crimes, but also with respect to many other offenses, of course. This conference is limited, but the broad picture is important, that there was a wealth of criminal acts during that case law. And linked to that is also who were the accused persons, and they were the leaders during the genocide. And some of you probably know that we are talking about the prime minister, parliamentarian leaders, military leaders, media leaders, etc., etc. And it sends a strong signal, I think, if you establish accountability for the leaders. You cannot, in the aftermath of atrocity in an international tribunal, deal with, let's say, 800 perpetrators. You have to focus. And in that way, I would say that answering the special representative's question, the Rwanda Tribunal, in a way, showed, together with the ICTY and the 5 other more or less ad hoc tribunals, that it was possible to react and that international law was not empty words. Having said that, it is clear that the process is incomplete. It's selective. It doesn't deal with all conflicts. And even now, when we have the ICC, which is a general court, which is now the one to respond to this question, it's clear that the ICC has its challenges, and there will be a need to strengthen that institution. So that would be my short answer to this. And I'm taking up also Mr. Kravik's question about time in such processes. If you look at how much time was spent on each case, you will see there was a variety of cases. Some genocide trials were finished in about 30 days, which is actually rather record-breaking. And then you had other genocide cases that took years. So, but it depends on the complexity of the case. Now, that was your general introduction. Now more to the sexual issues. And it's interesting everyone knows the name of the Akayesu judgment. And what I think is important to remember at the outset, because you also want to look ahead and to ask, what shall we do, is that even if Akayesu is groundbreaking, both generally for the genocide, but also for the sexual aspects, it would not have been so, that judgment, according to the original indictment. The original indictment of the Akayesu case had no reference to sexual crimes at all. And it was only after the testimony of 2 witnesses, witness J and H, which prompted the judges to ask questions and then really digging into the issue whether this also revealed evidence of sexual crimes. And the prosecutor then immediately asked for an amendment of the indictment, and after having obtained that amendment, came back with more witnesses relating to sexual crimes. So the Akayesu case would have been quite different if it hadn't been for that amendment. And I think that's an important point because it illustrates the need for investigators and prosecutors to know what they are looking for and to really have focus of these crimes. And that was not the case in the 90s. You will recall that if you look behind the 90s, there was very little activity with respect to sexual crimes. So that is my first, more or less, procedural point on this. The second point I would like to mention is that what did then the ICTR do? And we can't go through that huge judgment. But my point is that, in a way, it transferred, since it was the first genocide convention, it transferred the interpretation of the genocide convention from the travel preparatoires and legal literature in textbooks into legal case law. And suddenly it was part of the law. And just to mention two examples, the first is the frequently mentioned point that the rape of Tutsi women was considered part of the provision of the genocide, according to the facts, because it was perpetrated against all Tutsi women and solely against them, as the court said, and often accompanied by the intent to kill them. They fell under the enumeration of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And because it fell under the definition, also rape. That had not been said before. That was the second, and this is the first substantive point. And part of this new interpretation, because it hadn't been done before, was a more specific clause, namely Article 2D, about prohibition imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And if you look at that judgment more carefully, you will see that there is a statement there, even if it was not directly relevant to any of the accused, that rape with the aim to prevent Tutsi children from being born is also part of the provision. So that was the second substantive points. On genocide, and now to rape, and here I think all of us also know, but just for recapitulation purposes, that the Akayesu bench tried also to define rape for the first time. There was no international definition, and they did so both with effect to crimes against, in particular with respect to crimes against humanity and some sub-clauses there. And that definition, which we will not go into here, was later slightly criticized, and there was some case law from the ICTY which developed the law. But the point is, there was the first definition, and that was the way they, and together with the ICTR and ICTY, this gave the speed for this process. So I think, frankly, that the Akayesu judgment sent a strong signal as regards accountability. And now a few words about the second point you asked, namely the Ukrainian Commission of Inquiry. Now, it was, of course, established 3 years ago, approximately, and we have now had 5 reports since we started our work. And in all 5 reports, there are considerable attention to sexual crimes. And it is clear from our findings that the Russian authorities have committed considerable, many crimes, rapes, other sexual violence, and we will not go into the detail here now, and that is being repeated, and it has even been in all reports, and it's even been mentioned as some kind of a pattern in the conflict, that these rapes in some specific situations, namely, for instance, when the Russians were going into homes to look for sympathizers of the Ukrainian authorities. So these are the findings. And now 2 points, which again points to the future, I think. Here, the sexual crime dimension was part of the Commission's inquiry from the very first minute. It shows exactly how, in the course of 30 years, a lot has happened. And if you also look at the staffing of the Commission, we have 2 general advisors, top people, excellent. So both the intention, I'm coming back to the lack of indictment 30 years earlier, and the resources and the expertise, in a way, has given the Commission this possibility to focus much more on sexual crime than we did. And my final point is this. You mentioned that during the genocide, there were examples of rape against young men. And here I want to draw the parallel, but this was not much spoken about. I don't remember many cases about that at the ICTR. But here at the Ukrainian Commission, we have found a lot of crimes against men, sexual crimes, in particular as part of torture, and in particular in detention camps. And I think that's a dimension which also points a bit to the future, that more focus is needed also in that direction. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Erik Moser, for that overview of how our understanding has changed. And picking up on that point, moving to Jackie True, since your research focuses very much on sexual violence during conflict and atrocities, I would like to ask you how our knowledge from Rwanda has impacted our understanding of sexual violence during conflict and atrocities, and also sort of more broadly, what is gained from understanding mass atrocities from a gender perspective?
Thank you for those questions. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with such eminent experts. And I think what I will say will possibly build on what the SRSG Patten already emphasised this morning, and also my colleague Honoré here. I think what's really fundamental about the Rwandan genocide and our reflection on the events of that genocide is that the violence was both gendered in its patterns and in its consequences. So I think we would emphasise there that a gender perspective on genocide is not about women. It's actually about the dynamics of the genocide. Because in the Rwandan genocide, as Honoré has stated, men and women were both victims and perpetrators. So it wasn't that women were only victims, and it wasn't that men were only perpetrators. So already we have a much more nuanced understanding of gender. But what is really important is that the gender identities of men and women were targeted, and they were mobilized, for gendered reasons. So let me just give it some examples there. So men, battle-aged men, were in a way killed, right? It's sex selective killing. They were targeted because that was obviously part of, the commissioning of the genocide. Whereas women, especially women of childbearing age, were raped. And here, for the first time, we are seeing how women, it's not just women being targeted, but it's ethnic minority women, right? With the intent to reproduce a certain homogenizing or to produce a nation or a state that's ethnically homogenous. And you can't do that without a gendered strategy, right? And I think then that mass sexual violence is very significant, not just in the acts of the violence, but what it tried to do in terms of reproducing a dominant ethnic group. But I think the consequences of this violence and the gendered patterns of the violence is also really, really important. And I think why sexual violence itself is increasingly often, and it's often used, I don't think we can say increasingly because I think it has been a hidden crime, but why it's used in so many conflicts, in so many contexts, in every global region, is because of the gendered inequalities, which means that this type of violence attaches to the victim, and usually the woman and her family and her community faces such social stigma and shame that they don't come forward with their stories. They don't seek justice. So it is effective in oppressing entire communities and not only individual women. And so in the case of Rwanda, what happened is that a lot of men who survived were able to flee and left for displacement camps in other countries, and women were left as heads of households, single mothers, mothers of war babies, survivors, right? Survivors of the nation. So a really, really different experience in the aftermath of genocide, in part because of the gendered nature of the genocidal killing and violence. So I think that experience, the Rwandan experience, means that we can't actually understand the patterns of genocide, the consequences of genocide, and let me also say how genocide happens in terms of the preparation for genocide. And I think what we've learned is the importance of a gender perspective in prevention. And there it's the SRSG mentioned a lot about risk factors, early warning, and I think this is what is most important. So where you have high levels of gender inequality, where women don't have sexual and reproductive rights and freedoms, and where there are not safe pathways to report violence, recognition of that violence and justice for that violence, it's much more likely to be used. It's much more effective. It's much more likely to generate widespread stigma, shame, and oppression. So I think what's really important then is that in the Rwandan case, rape was already being used to test the potential for a genocide to be effective. And already rape was occurring to see, gee, how far can we push this violence? Can we commission a genocide? Will anyone notice? Will anyone report this violence? Will it be noticed by the international community? And what the perpetrators learned in that genocide was that no, it would not be. It was not noticed. It was not reported. And yes, they could continue with their campaign of genocide. So when we look now to other situations, we need to look at those early warning signs. We need to look for those unofficial reports of sexual violence, especially being targeted against particular minority communities, because that is the warning sign for the potential for greater violence, more generalized violence. And I think we can see that in many cases. And I guess what I want to say is that I think the knowledge, the investigative capacities that have been built up over the last 30 years are very, very important, but I still think we need more knowledge. And that knowledge often comes from the ground. And the really significance of the Women, Peace and Security agenda is highlighting not just the national and international legal capacities, but the important capacities of peace builders in communities who educate about these types of violence and who can provide a pathway for those in the community to report early signs of violence. and also to to empower women in particular to challenge norms, the norms that silence women's experience of sexual and gender-based violence. And here I think it is really important to extend perhaps the category beyond sexual violence to include a range of different types of violence, and gender-based violence would include things like early marriage, which are also strategies used by armed groups to bolster their, their cohort in advance of any, violent campaign.
Well, thank you so much, Jackie. Moving on now to Savita from the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect, which is the leading civil society organization in this field of atrocity prevention and R2P. What is and what should be the role of civil society in promoting a gender perspective in genocide and atrocity prevention? And how could a gender perspective, such as the Women, Peace and Security agenda, enhance atrocity prevention from where you sit in this debate?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having us all here. I'm still always very happy to be amongst people, because on Zoom I was telling Eric this, that the conversations become more transactional, but here beyond the panel we can continue to have these conversations and learn from each other. But I would also like to thank the organizers and Ellen, you personally, for bringing us all here, and Peder and Andreas for organizing this and making it so smooth. So thank you for that. I mean, that's a fantastic question, and speaking after SRSG Patten and then such an esteemed panel, most important things have already been said. The light has been shown on issues that are important, and how we approach them has been discussed. But I think that what I'm going to just say is adding on a layer coming from where we sit, where the Global Center sits, and where civil societies comes from. So in that context, I mean, just building on what Jackie said earlier, that it's so, when R2P was adopted, when R2P came into being, it was essentially gender blind. I mean, the focus was so much on populations, and to sort of, take away the emphasis on civilians or even citizens, and the focus was so much on populations that the aggregated effect of atrocity crimes on different genders was not really talked about. And as discussions on implementation moved forward, practitioners realized, and I mean, I think that it's knowledge we all have gained together over the last 30 years, that all aspects of gender atrocity prevention are gendered. And Jackie talked about this very, very eloquently. But I think that despite this, we need much more nuance, especially in early warning. The data is really still a problem. I mean, in some instances, you have more data on sexual and gender-based violence, but we are still lagging behind in many, many crises where gendered violence is still a very important aspect of how crimes are committed. And the two patterns that we see consistently across the board are sort of this conflation of the WPS agenda, the women's issues, and gender. And I think that we need to go beyond this and unpack a little bit more, especially in policy discussions. I think that in the academia, in sort of the legal sphere, this is much more nuanced, but in policy, it's still not. So this conflation of women and gender is very, very common. And what this does is that, we say at the Global Center that atrocity crimes, every gender experiences atrocity crimes differently, and every gender's experience of atrocity crimes is different. And we say this again and again because every person experiences atrocity crimes based on intersectionally where they sit, based on their ethnicity, based on their gender, based on their life experience, based on their age, their abilities, all of those factors. And when we do this, we sort of take away the kind of complexity which LGBTQI populations face, which men and boys face, which other genders face in how they experience atrocities. So the focus on women, or I mean, it's not even the focus of women, which is absolutely essential given the scale of gender and sexual violence against women around the world right now. But by subbing women into a gendered approach, we are doing a disservice in how we collect data, how we do early warning, how we understand the dynamics of atrocity crimes. And the second thing that we do is, again, defaulting, and Jackie said this, defaulting to looking at the experience of atrocities for women from only a sexual and gender-based perspective. Women experience atrocities through very, very different means, how they are tortured, how they're detained. There's so many different aspects. And again, not necessarily violence-based atrocity crimes, but just in general, the gender persecution they face. So, and again, and what this does is that it takes away sort of the nuance that we need in understanding how men and boys, lesbian, bisexual, transgender women, as well as gay and intersex persons are also at risk of SGBV. So I think, again, it's just the more nuance we can bring, the more aggregation we can bring in how different parts of the society faces atrocity crimes, it's important. And that's what I think that civil society organizations are doing more and more in terms of understanding how risk factors evolve, how people experience risk. And again, building, and that's what happens when you come after Jackie has spoken, that in the context of sort of looking at it from a perspective of early warning, it's so important. In the atrocity prevention community, we consistently look at discrimination, marginalization of ethnic communities, of protected populations, and the hate speech against them. But we somehow sort of not take into account the extreme gender discrimination that not only women face, but also LGBTQI communities. Modern history from the Holocaust, what we have seen is that in society, more and more when we see a discourse around cis heteronormativity as well as masculine discussions, it takes away the, I'm sorry. So it's so important to sort of place risk for atrocity crimes, not only in the context of the risks and the hate speech and the marginalization that ethnic and protected groups feel, but also what women and other genders as well as LGBTQI are facing. And this is such a bellwether of atrocities to come. So that's sort of the early warning part of it. In terms of response, again, it's not so much about the outcomes, but tactics which are used, separation of men and women, how women experience atrocities versus how men experience atrocities. And for us to respond to these threats effectively, we need to again take into account how people experience atrocities based on their different genders. In the context of response, again, women are heads of households, men are in detentions or killed. So all of these different things, they should be taken into account of how we think about this. And the role that civil society organizations, the role that civil society organizations have played in this is to consistently talk about this nuance. We have Akila here who's been doing an amazing amount of work in how, gender apartheid should become the part of vocabulary when we're talking about the extreme forms of gender persecution being faced by women in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia. Eric has this experience of having two gender advisors within his team. Civil society organizations like the Global Center, consistently work with different investigative mechanisms, not only to make sure that you have gender advisors, but to make sure that your translators are also women, because as we know, women and girls are more highly impacted by sexual and gender-based violence. And if you have translators who are only men, then it's harder for them to talk about it. Making sure that this black box of UN is consistently opened up for national human rights defenders, for local civil society organizations, for women's organizations who are actually working on the ground, are the first people who can provide early warning, but as Pramila Patten said, are the ones who are heard last. So again, the role of civil society, the role of international civil society is to not, and here I'll just sort of very clearly, I've just beg your indulgence, is to make sure, and this is not only what is done by states, but also INGOs do it, that sometimes we use women and populations of different genders from survivor and victim communities as props. We think that they will come and tell their stories and that will lead to some policy outcomes. We have to think about them not as props, but as people who come from various different kinds of perspective and who add a lot of nuance into how policy has to be made. So again, not using them as props, but really sort of taking advice from them on how policy has to be directed. So there's so many different examples of how civil society organizations do this, but sort of the most important example of that is that more nuance in early warning and data collection. And the other part is to making sure that those, for INGOs like the Global Center, making sure that the voices of local civil society, national civil society, human rights defenders are heard, and not only in the context of what is happening to them, but hearing them in the context of how we craft better protection and prevention strategies.
Thank you, Savita. We're nearing the end of the seminar, only a few minutes left. So before we wrap up, I would like to ask the other panelists if you want to make a short comment on what has been said during the debate. Maybe, I mean, it's not, you don't have to, but if you want to spend a minute, Erik.
I'm happy to do so. First of all, let me first say that all of us agree that early warning and prevention is really the key here. But being a narrow-minded lawyer or tribunal person, I have to also look a bit more into these accountability questions once it happens. I think really it is essential that the accountability implementation becomes as efficient as possible. It's about credibility and about believing that the norms are real. So that's something that really, and this is a responsibility for all current international courts to do as best as they can, even if the world is an evil place and even if there are many conflicts. And my second point is the signal about the need to react concerning sexual violence and related crimes. As I said, that came early and it was followed up. It was followed up first by a lot of judgments in the ICTR and then in all the other tribunals. So that's in a way done, I think. But now I come to the third point, namely the question of the situation of the victims, stigma, investigations of these crimes. And again, even if I said that a lot has happened, there is a need with top quality investigations in order really to succeed in this field. And I really agree with this issue that it's so sensitive in many countries. You saw it in Rwanda and you see it in Ukraine. Marriages break down. It's terrible. I have a final anecdote before sending the word on, and that is one of our gender investigators was approaching a group of women, and she had a sign here where it was written gender advisor, and no one wanted to speak with her. And then subsequently, she approached either the same group or a similar group, and she had just investigator. And then she was approached. And I think that shows on the ground how difficult this is and really the need for top quality investigators. So these are my few additional remarks.
Jackie, do you want to comment to that?
Yeah, sure. On, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I think there is great potential with early warning, and I think, you know, I just also echo that point. And in the research I've done with my colleague Sarah Davies, who I think is going to speak online in the afternoon, we did a 10-year study of Myanmar, Philippines, and Sri Lanka. And we were looking at not just the official reports, and for example, the reports that are compiled by the Office of the SRSG, but also unofficial reports through NGOs, but also by the media. And what we could, you know, we were doing this from 1990, for the period 1998 initially to 2016. And we could already see in Myanmar heightened reports of sexual and gender-based violence in Rakhine State in Myanmar, and this is before the genocide. And looking at that now, we've just published the book-length study of that. It's called Hidden Wars, published by Oxford. I can see the real potential in if we actually use real-time, unofficial reporting to kind of indicate a pattern of violence and to be able to respond to that in real time. You know, and if the international community has even better early warning systems, you know, we could actually have even greater prevention capacities. And I think that's really important, even though the types of sexual and gender-based violence might differ by context, by area. And I think where this might come back to the case of Ukraine is, again, the role of the media. Because when you have access, international access, press freedom, you are much more likely to get some of these reports, right? And when you have humanitarian access as well, you're more likely to get these reports. You're more likely to be able to early warn. And of course, in many situations, you don't have international access. But pushing for things like international commissions is so important, you know, to be able to document these crimes, and still with the hope of preventing further crimes. But I think greater training and education is needed of media, because often they are not well trained in survivor-centered methods of interviewing and investigating. They just want the front page story, and they have no qualms with interviewing the same survivor over and over again and kind of repeating the trauma. And I think that is what causes harm, even when we think we are contributing to the solution. So I think, you know, and when we are looking at, you know, the most sensitive contexts, where often in the, you know, in the post-conflict phase, we still have this problem of, I think we have talked about it, where survivors are not. I mean, the SG said her 4 recommendations, survivors are not at the heart of rebuilding institutions, of genocide prevention, of policy making. And that is in part because of the harm that's often created during the processes of investigation, not by lawyers or not by those, you know, those seeking to promote accountability, but by media and by public figures.
Omar, do you want to make a quick last remark?
Yeah, sure. Jack responded a comment that I was going to make about media, because yeah, I agree, it's very important, and when you have media, there is a chance that you get much more on the information of what happened and how this is happening. But also, when you analyze the media nowadays, they want as you said, the front page news, and at a certain moment it causes much more trauma to the victims, who will again retract from telling you really the truth of what happened. As to sort of conclude, when you look at what is happening nowadays, 30 years after the genocide against the Tutsi, in my opinions, there are tools, and there is a lot of efforts being made to tackle this issue of gender in the conflicts and gender violence in either genocide or where the conflicts are happening. However, I see them getting to a point where they become stagnant, and I don't know why. If it's in human nature, we see it being repeated, because whenever conflict emerges, immediately you will have hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of gender violence. And it's becoming the biggest weapon that humans can use against their fellow humans before they even try to use guns or even other tools. And I think the question for all of us in this room is, where are we not doing it right, so that if ever conflicts are emerging, this is something that is very much tackled, and we have ways of actually the accountability aftermath that maybe warns the next conflict, or that warns what would happen in another country. So that stagnant point is still a question for myself that I even pose to all of us. Where are we not doing it right so that it can achieve what we want it to achieve? And conferences like this may be part of the response, but not fully.
Do you want to have a brief comment to that, Savita, to wrap up?
Yes, absolutely. I think building on what everyone has said, and sort of this struck me when SRSG Patten was talking about it. She said peace is not a passive endeavor, you know, and we have to all remember this, because how you behave in peace is how things will, you know, either evolve, or the dynamics will sort of flow from that in the times of war. And I think that in societies where there is more respect for women, where gender norms are more respected, even in times of war, you don't see that level of sexual and gender-based violence. And maybe like there is not that much empirical, I mean, you have done this work before, but in societies where gender violence is normalized, you just see a higher impact of that. I mean, Balkans is an example, Rwanda is an example. I mean, the examples never end with Myanmar, Ethiopia right now, in Sudan and South Sudan. So I think that it's so important to sort of think about how our education systems are designed. And, you know, I mean, in these kinds of spaces, we constantly talk about international justice and, you know, specialized courts. But it's so important. The building block of this is national level, you know, legal systems, national level laws, you know, how a country behaves, how governments behave in terms of holding those perpetrators responsible at a domestic level really, really is important. So I think that it's not just about prevention, but it's also about prevention at the national level, which is the most important part of how we are actually going to protect more and more people. And then the sort of the final thing is, again, you know, just thinking constantly in terms of from protection clusters to accountability, bringing in that gendered perspective and not treating people from the affected communities as if they are props. And I can't say this enough, because sometimes we get these lists from the UN Security Council members who want a briefer from a particular country, and that list would include things like, oh, should be a woman, should speak English, should be a survivor of sexual and gender-based violence, but, you know, make sure that she's not too political because the discussion is humanitarian. And it's just offensive, like so deeply offensive. So I think that it's just so important to consistently think about these people not as props, but as actual people who are going to affect policy, because they are the most important stakeholder in all of these discussions.
Thank you, Savita. And I'll give the last final word to Ingrid.
Thank you so much to all the speakers who have talked here today, and thank you to the panel. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your insights, your knowledge. My name is Inger Kjelsbæk, and I'm one of the co-organizers. I'm head of the Gender Studies Department at the University of Oslo, and also a research professor at PRIO. And I have also worked in this field for a long time. And I think you've shown us in different ways that kind of the horrors, the incomprehensible horrors that we're actually talking about in Rwanda and other catastrophes of the 1990s, they still linger. But we have learned quite a lot. And I think it's fair to say that I think it's inconceivable today to have processes of transition from armed conflict to peace, and all the mechanisms that are in place and can be improved, but are in place to facilitate that process. It's inconceivable to have these without also having gendered perspectives, gendered concerns, gendered documentation, and so on. But still, there is more to address, as has been said. The issue of gender being more than women. It also has to do with sexual minorities and men. And one thing that has been touched upon that I am very concerned about now is also children being conceived by this particular violence that we're talking about, which makes this violence very unique. And I think also we have a lot of learning from Rwanda on that. how children conceived through these acts, criminal acts, are how they live their lives and how societies deal with them. I want to thank the co-organizers, everyone. And I just want to end by saying it may be very naive, but I think we always have to remember what we're talking about are not natural catastrophes. These are man-made decisions for mass atrocities to happen, and we can have man-made and women-made decisions to not make them happen. So on that maybe a little bit optimistic note, I think we should end the day, and I wish you a good day onwards. Thank you.